You ever feel like the woods are watching you? The Appalachian Trail stretches for over 2,000 miles, peaceful, scenic, but hiding things it was never meant to show. Tonight we're diving into 10 real stories from hikers who saw things they can't explain. Whispers in the fog, campsites torn apart, people who vanished just off the path and were never found. If you're brave enough to walk this trail with me, like this video, it helps these terrifying tales reach more horror fans like you. Comment where you're watching from, because every viewer is part of my horror family, and I want to know where my family's tuning in from tonight. And when the final story ends, tell me which one chilled you the most. Subscribe, because your support keeps this campfire burning, and the shadows creeping in closer. Now let's begin. I'd been walking the Appalachian Trail for nearly a week, pacing myself with the early October air, the kind that smells faintly of leaf rot and damp stone. Nights had been long and quiet, broken only by the occasional whip-poor-will or the distant crack of branches under some unseen weight. I wasn't new to hiking alone, but the deeper I went into the mountains, the more it felt like the landscape pressed in. Dark ridges looming over narrow valleys, fog creeping like smoke in the mornings, silence where I expected wind. That afternoon, I'd strayed slightly from the marked trail. Not far, just down a faint animal path that dipped into a holler. My legs were tired, and I thought maybe I'd find a place more sheltered than the open ridges to set camp for the night. That's when I saw it. At first, it didn't even register as man-made, just a lump of branches and bark wedged between two dead trees. But as I got closer, I realized it was a shelter, something built with intention. The walls were carefully stacked saplings, lined with a mixture of pine boughs and mud. The roof sagged but held together, and a small entrance had been carved out, barely wide enough for me to stoop through. It looked new. Not pristine, but not old enough to be abandoned either. I stood there longer than I probably should have, listening. The forest around me was still, save for the drip of water somewhere deeper in the hollow. Finally, I crouched and peered inside. That was when I saw the belongings. They were arranged neatly, like someone had placed them with purpose. On one side sat a pair of scuffed hiking boots, mud-crusted but set carefully heel to heel. A folded flannel shirt lay beside them, the fabric stiff with mildew. Against the back wall, stacked almost like an altar, were several small journals, spiral-bound notebooks, their covers warped from dampness. Next to them, I spotted packets of food, all opened but resealed with twine. The strangest part was how deliberate it felt. These weren't the scattered leavings of a hiker who moved on. They were staged. I crouched lower, my head nearly brushing the roof, and that's when I noticed it sitting on top of one of the journals was a toothbrush, brand new, bright white handle, and the bristles glistened as if they'd just been used. Tiny droplets of water clung to them. I froze, staring at it. Every other item was decayed, softened by the damp air of the holler, but not that toothbrush. A sour smell reached me then, like old food left too long in plastic, faint but sharp. My stomach tightened. I backed out, brushing dirt from my hands, and glanced around the woods. The slope was empty, trees leaning against the fog, but suddenly it felt like I was being watched. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe some through hiker had stopped here, someone strange about their habits. Maybe they'd brushed their teeth and stepped out to gather water. But the journals bothered me. Why would anyone leave them there stacked like relics? And why arrange the belongings so carefully instead of tossing them aside like normal camp gear? I stood there until the light began to sink. The fog had thickened, muffling the holler in gray. Finally, I pulled myself back onto the animal path, heading toward the marked trail again. My pack felt heavier than it had all week. That night, I made camp on a ridge under the pines, but I barely slept. Every time the wind stirred the branches or a deer cracked through the brush, I thought of that toothbrush, wet, waiting, like whoever used it hadn't gone far at all. The next morning, I debated whether to keep walking north or turn back. The image of the shelter clung to me, gnawing at my thoughts. I told myself it was curiosity, but it was more than that. It was dread, the kind that only deepens when you ignore it. By midday I had circled back, retracing the faint path down into the holler. The shelter looked the same as before, slumped between the dead trees. But something had shifted. The boots that had been neatly paired inside were gone. The folded flannel was still there, damp and sagging, but the boots were missing. I didn't step inside this time. Instead, I crouched at the entrance and listened. Nothing but the hollow drip of water. My skin prickled. Whoever was here, they had come back. Against my better judgment, I reached in and slid one of the journals toward me. The paper was swollen and soft, the ink bleeding in places. The handwriting was cramped, slanted, and hard to read. I caught fragments, could hear them again last night. Don't think they know about this spot yet. Keep everything together. Don't let it scatter. The words bled into nonsense, pages curling with damp, but the tone wasn't casual. It was frantic. I put it back exactly where I found it. My hands shook as I did, leaving smears of mud on the cover. That's when I noticed the toothbrush again. This time it was gone. I stood quickly, scanning the trees. The fog had lifted some, leaving long gray beams through the branches, but I couldn't shake the sense of presence, like the holler itself was holding its breath. Backing away, I kept my eyes on the shelter. My boots slipped on the slope, sliding in the wet leaves, but I didn't care. I scrambled until I was back on the ridge, heart hammering. The rest of the hike was a blur. I pushed harder than I'd planned, barely stopping for food, always checking behind me. Every hiker I passed on the main trail, I studied too long, looking at their packs, their boots, their faces, wondering if one of them had just stepped away from that shelter minutes before I found it. By the time I reached town days later, I was exhausted. The ordinary noises of people, cars, voices, music spilling from an open door, felt too loud, too sharp. I never told anyone about the shelter, not a ranger, not another hiker. I didn't want to explain why I'd gone off trail, or why I hadn't just walked away, but even now, I keep thinking about it. The damp flannel folded so carefully, the journals stacked like they mattered, and most of all the toothbrush, fresh, wet, and waiting, like I'd stepped into someone's private ritual, someone who had only left for a moment, and might have been watching me the whole time. I don't know why I stopped there that night. I'd been on the Appalachian Trail for nearly a week, moving slow through the southern ridges of North Carolina. The air was heavy with late spring rain, and the mud clung to my boots like it didn't want to let go. Most hikers I met along the way were friendly, but I hadn't seen another soul in almost 2 days. By the time dusk came, I was exhausted, my legs buzzing like static. That's when I spotted the tower. It rose above the tree line like a skeleton, the steel frame bleached by years of rain and wind. The old fire lookout cabins were mostly gone now, stripped by time or vandals, but this one still had its upper deck intact. The bottom half was swallowed by thickets and moss, the whole thing leaning just slightly, like it was tired of standing. I figured the open space nearby would make a decent place to set up camp, better than stumbling around in the dark looking for level ground. The air was thick with the smell of wet pine, and the fog rolled low across the valley. I dropped my pack under the tower and set my tent just at the edge of the tree line, far enough away that if the structure creaked in the night, I wouldn't feel like it was right on top of me. The place had a strange stillness, no cicadas, no night birds, just the occasional drip of rain sliding down through the steel bones of the tower, echoing faintly like hollow footsteps. I tried not to think about it, focusing instead on boiling water for my instant noodles, but I couldn't ignore the way the tower seemed to loom. Every time I looked up, the fog seemed to make it taller, stretching into the dark like it didn't have an end. After I ate, I climbed the first few steps out of curiosity. The stairs were slick with rust and rain, the kind of metal that leaves a reddish dust on your fingertips. My headlamp caught bits of graffiti carved into the beams, names, dates, crude drawings. One read, "Don't stay after dark." Another, "He waits on the stairs." I laughed a little under my breath, telling myself it was just kids trying to spook each other. Still, I didn't go far. The higher I climbed, the more the tower shifted with my weight, groaning like an old ship at sea. I turned back down, shaking the nervous energy out of my arms. By midnight, the rain had picked up. It pattered against my tent in uneven rhythms, sometimes soft, sometimes angry. I couldn't sleep. Every sound outside pressed in too close. The wet fabric smelled like mildew, and the cold worked its way through my sleeping bag. Sometime around 2 in the morning, I heard it, the sharp metallic clang of a boot on steel. My body stiffened instantly. I held my breath, listening. Another step, higher this time, then another. The sound echoed strangely in the fog, but I knew exactly what it was. Someone was climbing the fire tower. I fumbled for my flashlight, but didn't turn it on. I just lay there paralyzed, listening to each deliberate step as they climbed higher. The weight shifted the tower just slightly, enough to groan with each footfall, then silence. Whoever it was had stopped halfway up. That's when I heard the breathing, slow, uneven. It carried through the night, almost hidden under the sound of rain. I told myself it had to be wind rushing through the tower's frame, but no matter how hard I tried, it didn't sound like that. It sounded human. Minutes passed, or maybe just seconds. My mind raced. Another hiker. A drifter, someone who didn't want me there. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I unzipped the tent just enough to poke my flashlight out, my hand trembling. I pointed it straight at the staircase, flooding it with light. Nothing. The stairs were empty. My breath caught in my throat. I swung the beam back and forth, searching for movement, for a shadow, for anything. But the tower just stood there, dripping with rain, the rust shining wet. I closed the tent slowly, heart hammering so hard I thought it would wake the whole forest. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When morning came, the forest looked almost innocent again. Birds were calling. Mist rose off the ground in long ribbons. For a while, I wondered if I had just imagined the whole thing, if the exhaustion and the isolation had gotten to me. But then, I saw the stairs. About halfway up, where I had heard the breathing stop, the metal was wet in a different way. Not just rain. Something darker had soaked into the rust. The steps looked slick, almost greasy, like oil or sweat. I reached out to touch it, then pulled my hand back before I made contact. Whatever it was, it didn't feel right to disturb it. I packed quickly, desperate to put distance between myself and the tower, but as I was rolling my tent, I noticed something else. My boot prints from the night before were there, sunk into the mud. Next to them, fainter but still visible, were others, heavier, wider spaced, leading from the trees to the base of the tower. I froze. The tracks were fresh, edges sharp, not yet washed out by rain. I followed them with my eyes up to the first step, where they vanished into the climb. I didn't wait. I strapped my pack and moved fast down the trail, not looking back. Every sound behind me felt like footsteps. Every break in the trees felt like someone watching. For the rest of the hike, I couldn't shake the memory of that breathing. The way it seemed close enough to fog my tent, the emptiness when I shined the light. Even now, years later, I sometimes wake up at night with the sound replaying in my ears. Slow, heavy breaths, straining like each one took effort. I'll lie there in the dark, holding my own breath, waiting for silence to return. I never told anyone on the trail what I'd seen, or what I thought I'd seen. By the time I reached town, it felt too unreal, too fragile to speak out loud. But I didn't camp near structures anymore. Not towers, not cabins, not abandoned shacks, because I don't know what I heard that night. But I know I wasn't alone. I'd been on the Appalachian Trail for almost 2 weeks when it happened. I wasn't doing the whole through hike, just a long section that wound its way through western North Carolina. I'd left Irwin, Tennessee a few days earlier, moving slow, not really chasing miles. I had time, more time than I knew what to do with. That afternoon, the trail bent downhill, cutting through a stretch of oak and hickory. Everything smelled damp, like wet leaves that had been rotting under snow for months. The sky was heavy, colorless. Clouds sat low on the ridges, smearing fog between the trees. By the time I reached a narrow stream, my boots were soaked through and my knees were aching. The water was shallow, only a few feet wide, trickling over slick stones. I set my pack down on the bank and lowered myself onto a rock. My back cracked when I sat, and I felt the relief spread through my shoulders. I pulled out a granola bar and just listened for a while. Birds somewhere distant, the faint groan of wind moving across the hollow, the water pressing through rocks. That's when I noticed him. Across the stream, not more than 10 feet away, a man was crouched low at the edge of the water. He wasn't moving, wasn't drinking, wasn't tying a shoe, just crouched, knees bent, arms resting on them, looking straight at me. I froze, the granola bar halfway to my mouth. "Hey," I said finally, trying to keep it casual. No answer. His clothes were dark, muddy maybe, and his face was shadowed by the low branches, but his eyes were visible, locked on mine. The stream gurgled between us, and the longer I sat there, the more wrong it felt. Something about the stillness. Most hikers nod, wave, call out a hello, but this man just crouched like he'd been there long before I arrived, like he'd been waiting. I cleared my throat. "You all right?" Still nothing. A knot formed in my stomach. I looked away, pretending to fiddle with the wrapper in my hands. Just a second, no more. But when I lifted my eyes again, he was gone. Not gone like he'd walked off down the trail. Gone like he'd never been there. Except the water told me otherwise. Ripples were spreading from the bank where he'd crouched, distorting the reflection of the branches. I stared at the spot until the ripples disappeared, until the water smoothed back into itself. The silence pressed harder now. Even the birds seemed to have stopped. I told myself he'd slipped back into the trees, that maybe he'd been shy or wary. This wasn't a city. People out here didn't owe me small talk. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't walked away, that he was still there, just out of sight, watching from behind the veil of trees and fog. I stuffed the wrapper into my pocket, slung my pack over my shoulders, and crossed the stream without looking back. But for the rest of the day I couldn't stop hearing the water ripple in my head. I pushed harder than usual that evening, maybe out of nerves. By the time I came across the old cabin, my legs were rubber and the light was bleeding fast from the sky. It wasn't on any map I had, just appeared off a spur trail, sagging between two hemlocks. The roof was bowed in the middle, and the boards looked black with rot, but the stone chimney was still intact. Smoke hadn't risen from it in years. The cabin door hung open a few inches. Inside was only darkness. Normally I'd have kept walking, set up camp away from structures like that. But the thought of pitching my tent alone in the fog, with that image of the crouching man still stamped in my mind, made the cabin weirdly inviting. At least it had walls. The floor groaned when I stepped inside. The air smelled of mildew and animal droppings. A few pieces of furniture slumped in corners, an overturned chair, a small table scarred with knife cuts. The fireplace was filled with damp leaves. I swept the floor with my boot until I found a dry enough corner and unrolled my sleeping bag. As I worked, my eyes caught on something carved into the table. Initials, dates, scratched deep into the wood. The most recent one stopped me cold. April 2019. By the stream. I don't know why, but I touched the grooves with my fingertip. The letters were ragged, almost frantic, as if whoever cut them had been rushing. The night pressed in quick. I lit my headlamp, its narrow cone of light, making the corners seem darker. That's when I noticed another detail. The table wasn't just carved with words. It was gouged along the edge, deep parallel scratches running down the side. Not the kind an animal would make. I lay in my bag fully clothed, pack close against me, knife in hand. I told myself the man I'd seen was a hunter, a drifter, someone who lived rough out here. That the carving on the table was coincidence, but every sound, the drip of water through the chimney, the creak of beams in the wind, set me on edge. At some point, I must have dozed off. I woke to the faintest sound of water trickling, not outside, but in the room with me. My heart kicked hard. I clicked on my headlamp. The beam swept across the floorboards. The sound stopped instantly, like someone holding their breath. Nothing, just the empty cabin. I didn't sleep after that. I waited, every muscle tense, until the gray of morning finally leaked through the cracks in the walls. When I stepped outside, the world was wet with mist. I turned back once at the cabin, and saw something I hadn't noticed the night before. Near the doorway, in the mud, were marks. A crouch print, toes dug deep, heels lifted, as if someone had been sitting there all night, waiting. I didn't eat breakfast. I didn't even refill my water. I just walked, hard and fast, until my legs screamed. Even now, months later, I don't know what I saw that day at the stream, or who left those marks outside the cabin. I just know I've never shaken the feeling that I was meant to sit longer, to keep watching the water until the ripples reached me too. And that maybe next time, if I let my eyes slip away, I won't be quick enough when I look back. I'd been hiking alone for 4 days when it happened. I was somewhere in the Blue Ridge stretch of the Appalachians, a part of the trail most hikers skipped because the climb was punishing, and the shelters were in ruin. I liked it that way. The more isolated I felt, the easier it was to breathe. That night, I pitched my tent in a narrow hollow, where the fog clung to the ground like milk poured too thick. The earth was soft and damp, and the smell of wet pine and decaying leaves pressed in on me. I'd eaten from my small pack, zipped myself into my sleeping bag, and let the quiet of the valley swallow me. There were no distant voices, no rustling of fellow campers, just the uneven rhythm of crickets, and the occasional groan of the mountain shifting in the dark. I must have been asleep for a couple of hours when I heard it. A voice, close but low, pulling me out of whatever dream I'd been sinking into. It whispered my name. At first, I thought it was the wind combing through the tent fabric, but then it came again, clearer. Daniel. My eyes snapped open. I froze in my sleeping bag, staring at the thin nylon above me. I hadn't told anyone my name since leaving the trailhead days earlier. The few hikers I'd passed only offered a wave or a nod. Nobody had asked who I was. I waited, straining my ears. The forest was hushed now, too hushed. The usual hum of insects had flattened into a silence so wide it felt intentional. Finally, I unzipped the bag and pushed myself upright, the tent floor creaking beneath my weight. My flashlight sat near my boots, and when I clicked it on, the pale beam trembled as much as my hand. I unzipped the tent flap and scanned the fog. Nothing but gray trunks and drifting mist. Still, something felt wrong. My camp stove wasn't where I left it. It had been set beside my pack before I went to sleep, but now it leaned against the base of a tree 10 feet away. I stepped out barefoot, the mud slick and cold under my soles. My breath clouded in front of me. "Hello," I whispered, my voice barely leaving my throat. No response, just the creak of branches high above, stretching against each other. I brought the stove back, slid it beside my pack again, then ducked into the tent and zipped it up tight. My chest hurt from how hard I was breathing. Sleep didn't come easy after that. I lay awake, counting every tiny sound, every shift of the ground. By the time dawn filtered through the trees, I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. A dream, a trick of the fog and exhaustion. Still, when I crawled out of the tent, I noticed something that made my stomach lurch. On the side of my tent, near the bottom, was a smear of mud. A streak shaped like a handprint, the long drag of fingers pressed into the nylon. I told myself it must have been mine, that maybe I leaned against it without realizing. But even as I packed my gear, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there. inches from me while I slept, saying my name in the dark. I pushed further into the mountains, but the unease traveled with me. Every rustle of leaves became a footstep. Every crow's call seemed sharper, closer than it should have been. I barely ate. I barely spoke aloud. I just kept moving, as though distance alone could put space between me and that whisper. That afternoon, the rain came, a steady curtain that soaked through my jacket and made the soil slick underfoot. I stumbled down an overgrown section of trail until I came across an old cabin, its roof sagging, the porch tilting forward like it was tired of holding itself up. It wasn't on my map, but I was desperate to get dry. The door hung loose on one hinge. I pushed it open, and the smell of rot and mildew clawed at me. Inside, the floorboards bowed under my weight. A table sat against the wall, warped from water damage. Beside it, an iron bed frame with no mattress, only coils of rust and scraps of fabric. I set my pack down, trying to convince myself I'd found shelter, not another reason to leave. But as I looked around, my eyes caught on something. A small notebook lay on the windowsill, its cover soft and curling from the damp. I opened it carefully. The pages were smeared and fragile, but words still clung to them in shaky pencil. They weren't stories or journal entries. They were lists. Daniel, 3/14, whispered. My blood ran cold. I flipped further. Dozens of names filled the pages, each paired with a date, each followed by that same word, whispered. And mine was the most recent. I dropped the notebook as though it burned. My own name, in handwriting I didn't recognize, written in a place I had never been. The storm outside thickened, rattling the windows with its fists. The wind howled through the gaps in the walls, but beneath it I swore I heard something else. A voice pressed against the noise, threading through the cracks. Daniel. I bolted. I didn't care about the rain, didn't care about the mud sucking at my boots. I ran until the cabin was only a shadow swallowed by the trees. For the next 2 days I didn't stop moving. I hardly slept, collapsing only when my legs refused to carry me further. By the time I reached a town, a small place with a single gas station and a diner, I must have looked feral. People stared, but no one asked questions. I never told them what I'd seen. I don't tell anyone, not really. Because every night since, no matter where I am, I wake in the dark and swear I hear it again. That same whisper, curling out of the silence, reminding me that somebody, somewhere, still knows my name. And I don't think they'll ever stop saying it. I grew up hearing that the Appalachian trails were older than time itself, older than the maps and towns that tried to tame them. But I never believed that, until the morning I decided to take what I thought would be a shortcut. It was early, maybe a little after 6, when I started hiking. The fog was low and heavy, the kind that clings to your jacket and makes everything around you seem closer than it should be. I'd parked near a trailhead outside of Damascus, Virginia, planning to take the main path toward a cabin where I was supposed to meet a couple of friends. But I saw what looked like a thinner track veering off to the right, one that looked like it would cut across the ridge and save me an hour. At first, the ground was soft with pine needles, the smell of wet earth and moss hanging thick in the air. The only sound was the drip of last night's rain sliding off leaves. My boots squelched when the soil turned to mud, but I pressed on, certain I'd rejoin the main trail soon. After about half an hour, though, I realized I hadn't seen any markers, no painted blazes on the trees, no signs of other hikers. Just endless walls of spruce and oak, the kind that bent together and formed strange arches overhead. The air felt stiller, the deeper I went, almost muffled, like sound wasn't allowed to travel far. The first unsettling thing I noticed was a tree with deep, deliberate cuts spiraling around its trunk. They weren't the kind of casual marks kids make with pocket knives. These were thick, precise, and blackened around the edges, as if someone had burned them in. The smell lingered faintly, a charred sweetness that didn't belong in damp woods. I tried not to think about it. People carve up trees all the time. but something about those spirals, perfectly even as though measured, sat wrong in my stomach. Another 20 minutes, and the fog thinned just enough for me to see an opening ahead. A clearing. Relief washed over me, because I thought for sure I was about to stumble onto a road or maybe a ranger station. But the second I stepped out, I stopped dead. The ground was bare dirt, a wide circle maybe 30 feet across, and scattered across it were bones, dozens of them. Deer, raccoon, maybe even a dog. I'm no expert, but I know enough to tell they weren't just random remains. They were arranged, perfect circles of rib bones and femurs, spiraling inward like some kind of crude pattern. At the very center sat a skull, deer antlers jutting upward like a crown. The smell hit me next, sour, metallic, with a sweetness underneath, like meat left too long in the sun. I had to cover my mouth with my sleeve. For a long time I just stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was hunters, some ritual I didn't know about. But no, it was too deliberate, too neat. I finally forced myself to turn back. But when I stepped toward the line of trees I'd come from, my chest seized. The trail I'd followed was gone. I spun around, scanning the tree line. The undergrowth was thick everywhere, as if no one had ever cut through. I walked a few yards, brushing away wet branches, certain I'd find the path again. But there was nothing, just forest, closing in. That's when I noticed something else. The silence. No drip of water, no rustle of leaves, not even the distant call of birds. Just me, my breathing, and the bones. And in that silence, I swear, I felt the ground breathe beneath my boots. I don't know how long I stood there, trying to convince myself I hadn't just walked in a circle and lost the trail. My watch said it was almost 8. The fog hadn't lifted, it only clung tighter, like the clearing itself wanted to hold me there. I decided to push forward, away from the bones, figuring if I kept walking straight, I'd hit something eventually. But the further I went, the stranger it got. I started noticing more of those carved spirals, etched into tree trunks, some shallow, some so deep, the bark bled sap like old wounds. And around them, the forest floor looked disturbed, as if something had been dragged, long, wide streaks cutting through the mud. I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder. The fog distorted everything. Branches looked like arms reaching. Shapes seemed to shift when I blinked. I kept telling myself it was just my nerves, just the fog. About an hour later, I came across a cabin. It sagged under the weight of years, roof caved on one side, windows boarded. The wood was gray and swollen from rot. I hesitated, but the thought of being in the open clearing again made me push forward. The door was unlocked, its handle rusted and sticky under my palm. Inside, the air was thick with mildew, and something sharper rot. The floor groaned under my weight, each step echoing louder than it should have in such a small place. There were only 2 rooms. The first had an old wood stove, cold ash piled high inside, a table with one leg splinted by a branch, a chair overturned. Everything coated in a layer of damp dust, as if no one had been here in decades. But the second room is what I'll never forget. There were shelves nailed into the walls, lined with glass jars. Some held feathers, some held teeth. One was stuffed with animal fur, clumped together and matted with dark stains. And on the floor against the far wall lay more bones, stacked neatly, almost lovingly, like firewood. I wanted to run. I wanted to tear through the trees until I found pavement, another person, anything. But my legs wouldn't move. Because on the back wall, half hidden by shadow, was something else. A jacket. A faded blue rain jacket, hung on a nail. The exact kind my friend Mark had worn the last time we'd hiked these mountains together. The same one he'd lost, years back, on a trip when he swore it had been stolen from camp. I don't know how long I stared at it. My throat tightened. My stomach churned. There was no way it could be his, but I knew it was. I could almost see the tear on the sleeve where he'd caught it on barbed wire. That's when I heard it. Not a voice, not an animal. Just movement, slow, deliberate, from outside the cabin. leaves shifting under careful steps. I didn't breathe. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. The footsteps moved past the wall, paused at the door, then faded into the trees. I didn't follow. I didn't look. I stayed there, frozen, until the silence returned. And then I ran. I don't know how I found my way back. Hours later, I stumbled out onto a road, caked in mud, throat raw from breathing cold fog. I never looked back. That night, I tried to tell myself it was all in my head, that the bones, the spirals, the jacket, were just fragments of fear and exhaustion. But years later, I still wake up to the smell of that clearing, to the sound of footsteps outside the cabin door, and the worst part is knowing that I never found Mark's jacket again. Not on the trail, not in the cabin, not anywhere, just gone, like the path behind me. I'd been hiking alone for 3 days when I first saw him. The Appalachian Trail has a way of swallowing you whole. The fog, the dripping trees, the sound of your own boots pressing into wet soil. You start to forget that there's a world beyond the ridgelines. That morning, I'd been moving slow, letting the mist settle around me like damp cloth, when I heard the crunch of someone else's steps behind me. I turned, and there he was, an older man, thin, wiry. His beard was gray and tangled, his jacket torn at the shoulder. He didn't look like one of the weekend hikers I usually saw out here. He had no obvious pack, just a weather-stained satchel slung across his chest. "Morning," I said, keeping my tone casual. He gave a nod and came up beside me, falling into step like we'd planned it. His pace matched mine so perfectly that it was almost disarming. For the first mile, we walked in silence. The fog kept thickening, and every so often, I caught the sour smell of his damp clothes. Then he started talking. Not about the weather or where he was headed, just stories. Strange ones. "You'd be surprised how many folks never make it out," he said. His voice was low, almost as if he was talking more to himself than me. "You read the news. They'll say it was an accident. Hypothermia. Fell off a ridge. Heart attack. But I've walked past places where I know a man laid down and didn't get back up." I forced a laugh. "Well, that's comforting." He didn't smile. He just kept on, his boots sinking into the mud with a steady rhythm. "There's a holler down near Mac's Patch," he continued, "where I once found a backpack. Still had the man's food inside. Couple cans of beans, untouched. It had been there a long time, but the funny thing was, no critters had gotten into it. Like it had been left yesterday." I didn't know how to respond. The fog pressed in harder, and for a second, the trail around us seemed to narrow. My chest tightened. By late afternoon, my legs were burning. I told him I'd be stopping soon, near a clearing. I knew where the ground leveled out. He just nodded, like he'd already expected that. I set up camp on damp earth. The smell of pine needles and rot clung to everything, and the air had that heavy quiet, broken only by distant owls. When I lit my little stove, I noticed him again, just a few yards away, squatting beside his own small fire. The flames licked at the mist, sending shadows up the trunks of the trees. He didn't say a word. He just sat there, hunched forward, staring into the fire. His face flickered in the light, lined and sunken. I wanted to call out, maybe offer him some food, but something about the way he was sitting made me hold back. I crawled into my tent early. The fabric smelled faintly of mildew, and the sound of rain tapped lightly above me. Outside, his fire popped and cracked. I lay there in the dark, telling myself it was fine, that people camped near each other all the time. But I couldn't shake the feeling that his fire was too close, too deliberate. At some point, exhaustion took me under. The last thing I remember before sleep was the glow of his fire through the thin tent wall, burning steady, unwavering, like an eye that refused to blink. I woke just before dawn. The forest was hushed, wrapped in gray light. My body ached from the hard ground, but the first thing I noticed wasn't the soreness, it was the silence. No fire crackling, no footsteps, no sign of the old man. I unzipped my tent, and stepped out barefoot into the cold mud where his fire had been the night before. There was nothing. Not ashes, not embers, not even a ring of blackened earth, just damp leaves, glistening with dew, like no flame had ever touched them. I stood there for a long moment, the mist curling low around my legs. My own camp stove was still where I'd left it. My tent still stood. Everything about my setup felt normal. But that spot, bare, undisturbed, felt wrong. I tried to reason it out. Maybe I'd been more tired than I realized. Maybe I'd dreamed it. But the memory of that fire, the way the shadows bent across the trees, the crack of pine snapping in the flames, was too clear. I packed up quickly, my hands clumsy with the chill. Every few minutes, I caught myself glancing over my shoulder. The woods were dense, the trail winding. My boots sank into the wet ground with a sucking sound, like something below wanted to keep me there. By midday, I reached a ridge. The fog had thinned, revealing an old overlook where the ground gave way to a sharp drop. I sat down, trying to calm the gnawing tightness in my chest. That's when I saw it. On a low branch, nearby hung a piece of cloth, torn, weather-stained, the same color as the man's jacket. I froze. It dangled limp in the breeze, frayed at the edges like it had been there for years. I touched it. The fabric was damp, cold. I scanned the trees, half expecting to see him step out from the mist, but the woods stayed empty. The rest of the hike down was a blur. Every twist of the trail felt unfamiliar. Though I'd walked this section before, my legs trembled. My breath came shallow. More than once, I thought I heard another pair of steps behind me, but when I stopped, the silence pressed in heavy. I made it off the trail by dusk, stumbling out onto the dirt road that led to a small parking area. My car was still there, dew on the windshield, but I couldn't bring myself to get in right away. I just stood there, staring back at the tree line, waiting for movement. Nothing came. I never told anyone about the old man. Not really. A couple of times, I tried to mention it, just casually, to friends, but it always sounded too strange, too unfinished. People disappear in those mountains all the time, they'd remind me. Hypothermia, wrong turn, bad luck, but I can still see him. The way he matched my steps without effort. The way he sat by that fire, motionless, eyes fixed on something I couldn't see, and most of all, I can still see the ground where the fire should have been, bare, untouched, like it had never burned at all. I grew up in Virginia, not far from the Blue Ridge, but I had never hiked more than a few miles into the mountains before. Work, family, all the usual excuses kept me close to town. That changed in the fall of 2019, when a coworker mentioned a section of the Appalachian Trail near Bland County that was supposed to be quiet, overlooked by most travelers. I had been feeling restless, suffocated in my apartment, and the idea of disappearing into the mountains for a few days sounded perfect. The air that morning was heavy, damp with fog that clung to the hollers. The trail itself was narrow, hemmed in by oaks and hemlocks that dripped from the night's rain. My boots sank into soft mud, each step releasing the smell of wet earth and rotting leaves. There was no one else around, not a single voice, not even a car in the distance, just the soft creak of trees in the breeze, and the occasional tap of water dripping from branches onto my hood. About 3 miles in, I stopped to catch my breath and leaned against a thick poplar. That's when I saw it. Words scratched into the bark at about eye level. Don't go further. I couldn't get out. I assumed it was a joke, maybe some hiker's attempt to spook others. The letters weren't fresh. The edges of the carving had darkened, filled with sap. Still, the phrasing was strange. I couldn't get out. Wasn't how you'd expect someone to warn you. It sounded final, almost like a confession. I kept going. The trail narrowed. As it curved along a steep slope, the valley below swallowed by fog. My water bottle clinked against my pack with each step, loud in the silence. A mile later, I stopped dead in my tracks. On a pine tree to my left, carved with the same steady hand, "Don't go further." I couldn't get out. The exact same words, same spacing, Same handwriting. I felt a tightening in my chest, but I forced myself to laugh it off. Maybe a group of friends had done this as a prank, carving the same warning along a stretch of trail. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. The forest felt heavier, quieter. 2 miles later, I passed another tree. Same message. I slowed my pace. The trail here was lined with moss-covered rocks and old rusting fence posts, relics of farmland, long reclaimed by the forest. The smell of damp wood and something faintly metallic hung in the air. Then another carving, and another. By the time I reached the 6th tree, I wasn't laughing anymore. My throat felt dry, and every sound, the snap of a twig, the flutter of a bird's wings, made me flinch. I started counting the carvings without meaning to. 7, 8, 9. The words had been carved with such consistency, it was almost mechanical. Always the same message, never drifting in size or angle. Whoever made them had taken their time. As the daylight began to fade, I found a small clearing and dropped my pack. My plan had been to camp for the night, but the idea of sitting in the dark with those carvings etched in my mind made me hesitate. I set up my tent anyway, fumbling with the poles, my fingers stiff in the chill air. The forest pressed close around me. No wind now. No movement, just silence broken by my own breathing. I built a small fire with damp sticks and sat staring at the flames. When I finally lay down inside the tent, the carvings came back to me. That strange repetition, the steady hand, the words that sounded less like a warning and more like someone's last thought. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, but a part of me knew I wasn't going to sleep easy. The night passed in fragments, half sleep, sudden wakefulness, the kind where you don't remember drifting off, but you snap awake with your heart pounding. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside my tent, slow, deliberate, crunching on wet leaves. But when I held my breath, the sound faded, and all I could hear was the soft patter of dew dripping from the trees. By dawn, the fire had died to ash. My throat was raw, my head heavy. I considered turning back, but something in me resisted. Maybe pride, maybe denial. I told myself I'd go just a few more miles before heading home. The trail wound deeper into the woods, the fog lifting but the air still thick, unmoving. My boots slipped on slick roots, and more than once I had to grab a tree trunk to steady myself. That's when I saw the first one of the morning. Don't go further. I couldn't get out. My stomach tightened. The bark was fresher here. The wood pale, where it had been cut. The lines looked sharper, less weathered. I stopped, staring at it. I tried to measure the depth of the cuts, to guess how long ago they'd been carved, but my eyes wouldn't focus. I felt dizzy, as if the words themselves had weight. I kept walking, slower now, and the carvings kept appearing. Every few hundred feet, another tree. Same handwriting, same spacing, each one looking newer than the last. At the 12th carving, I noticed something else. A faint sting on the bark, dark and irregular, just below the words. I leaned in and smelled iron. Blood. I staggered back, bottle rising in my throat. My hands shook so badly, I almost dropped my water bottle. I wanted to turn around, to run back the way I'd come, but the forest pressed in from all sides, and the trail ahead seemed both endless and the only way out. I don't know how long I kept walking. Minutes, hours. It blurred. The forest felt wrong, like the silence was waiting for me to notice something. The fog thickened again, curling between the trunks. My thoughts spiraled. Who had written those words? Why keep repeating them? Were they following the same trail, trapped in the same loop, leaving behind their warning as they failed to escape? By the time I reached the ridge, the light was fading again. My legs ached, and I hadn't eaten since morning. I dropped to the ground, leaning against another tree, and there it was, carved at eye level. Don't go further. I couldn't get out. This one was so fresh, the wood was still curling outward, wet sap dripping down the bark. I stared at it, my chest tightening, and then my eyes shifted lower. On the ground, in the mud at the base of the tree, was a boot print. My size. My tread pattern, still dent pep, edges sharp. I don't remember standing up. I don't remember turning around. But I do remember the hollow sound of my own heartbeat in my ears, and the thought that maybe I hadn't been following someone else's warnings. Maybe I had been carving them myself. I left the trail that evening, stumbling back in the dark, branches tearing at my arms. I don't know how I made it to my car. To this day, when I think about that stretch of forest, I can still feel the mud clinging to my boots, smell the sap on my hands, see those words carved again and again. I don't hug anymore, because every time I close my eyes, I see that last carving, and I can't tell if I was the one who left it. I'd been hiking since late morning, but the Appalachian sun never rose fully that day. The whole ridgeline sat under a low, bruised sky that smelled like rain and rotting leaves. My boots were slick with mud from the valley climb, and each step crunched on wet gravel. This section of trail, somewhere between Iron Mountain Gap and Little Rock Knob, wasn't crowded in October. In fact, I hadn't seen another person for hours. I'd planned to camp near a shelter just off the trail, but dusk crept in quicker than I'd expected. The air felt heavy, saturated with that faint metallic smell that comes before rain. Below me, the woods fell steeply into a hollow, thick with bare trees whose branches looked like wet black veins against the mist. That was when I noticed movement down in the trees. At first, I thought it was a deer slipping between trunks, but then I realized it wasn't moving like an animal. It was upright, pacing in long, deliberate strides. A figure, dark clothing, maybe a hood, keeping perfect pace with me about 50 feet below the trail, separated only by a slope of leaf-strewn ground. I slowed, adjusting my pack straps. The figure slowed too. I sped up. It matched me. At first, my mind tried to find normal explanations. Maybe another hiker who'd left the trail, or a hunter in dark camo. But there was no orange vest, no visible gear, and something about the steadiness of its pace began to crawl under my skin. Whoever it was, they never looked up directly at me, but I could feel their attention like a wire between us. The trail ahead curled slightly along the ridgeline, and my heart beat harder as I realized I'd soon lose sight of them when it turned. I tried to keep them in view as long as possible. My boots slipped on damp leaves, sending a faint scatter of stones down the slope. And then, at the curve, the figure stopped. Just stopped. I stood there too, breathing hard. They were now completely still between two trees, looking upward, but not moving a muscle. I couldn't make out a face, just that dark outline, hands at their sides. The mist was settling thicker, and a crow somewhere deeper in the hollow gave a broken, cackling call that echoed weirdly off the ridges. I forced myself to keep walking, turning the corner. My mouth was dry. My pack felt heavier than it had all day. When the trees opened briefly, I glanced back, expecting nothing, but the figure hadn't moved at all, still watching. A few minutes later, I reached a small clearing with a crude wooden bench, an old trail marker someone had carved names into. The smell of wet wood and mold rose off it. I dropped my pack and dug for my flashlight, even though it wasn't fully dark yet. My fingers trembled as I tried to snap it on. I told myself it was nothing, some local cutting through the forest, a poacher maybe, but my body didn't believe me. There was no sound below now, no movement, just the muffled hush of mist rolling through branches and the low hiss of wind dragging over the ridge. I should have felt safer leaving that figure behind. Instead, the silence felt heavier, like it had been drawn out of the world. That night at the shelter, I didn't light a fire. I unrolled my sleeping bag on the wooden floorboards, which were soft and slightly spongy with age. The walls smelled of wet ash and old smoke. Someone had left a journal under a loose plank, a soggy composition notebook with cramped handwriting. The page I opened to read saw him again on the ridge. Always down below, don't go down. I shut the notebook. My heart thudded like it was trying to leave my chest. Outside, the forest was utterly still. I barely slept. The shelter creaked at intervals, the way old wood does when it cools. Rain began sometime after midnight, soft at first, then harder, dripping through gaps in the roof and pattering on the floor near my head. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure between the trees, perfectly still. At first light, gray, washed out. I packed quickly. My boots squished with each step as I got back on the trail. The air smelled of wet earth and crushed pine needles. I told myself I'd just keep moving, get off the ridge, reach a road or a town before dark. For an hour, it was only fog and my own breath. But as the trail descended toward a saddle, the trees thinned, and I felt that same pressure again, the sense of someone pacing me just out of sight. I stopped, scanning the woods below. Nothing, just mist clinging to the trunks, dripping water, and a faint smell of something sour, like rust or old meat. Then, I saw a shape, not moving this time, just leaning against a tree down the slope, a dark hood again. Only now, closer. I didn't shout, I didn't even think of it. I just kept walking, slower, my skin prickling with cold. A mile later, the trail split at an old signpost. One arrow rotted away, the other pointing to a side trail marked with a faded shelter sign. The wood smelled like mildew when I brushed my fingers over it. Someone had carved words into the post, half hidden under moss. He waits in the hollow. I stayed on the main trail. My boots made no sound now, the mud swallowing each step. The forest was so quiet my ears rang. Another half mile and the ridgeline curved again. When I reached the bend, I risked a look down. The figure was gone. Relief hit me like a wave, but then I saw something else, a faint path cutting down into the hollow, parallel to the trail. Footprints, fresh in the wet leaves, big ones, boots maybe. I froze, realizing whoever had been down there was close enough to hear me all along, maybe even close enough to see where I'd camped. My stomach went hollow. I walked faster, my pack straps digging into my shoulders. The mist was thicker now, curling between trees like smoke. Every few minutes I thought I heard a branch snap behind me, but when I turned, nothing. By late afternoon, my map showed a gravel road ahead, but the trail felt longer than it should, like I was circling something unseen. Then through the fog, I saw a cabin, off trail, sagging against the slope. Its roof was caved on one side, the windows black squares. I don't know why I went closer. Maybe to hide, maybe to see. The air around it was still, heavy with the smell of rot. Inside, the floor was warped with water damage, and old furniture lay overturned and mildewed. On the wall by the door hung a coat, dark, hooded, streaked with mud, the same kind of coat. I backed out slowly, my heart beat in my throat. The woods around the cabin were silent, except for water dripping from the eaves. Down the slope, the hollow deepened, a gray funnel of mist. I thought I saw a shape moving down there, slow and deliberate, but it might have been a tree swaying. I turned and walked as fast as I could until my knees ached. I didn't stop until I reached the gravel road, hours later, when full dark had fallen. My face was wet, but I couldn't tell if it was rain or sweat. Even now, weeks later, I can't stop thinking about how quiet the woods were that day. About the journal in the shelter, and the words on the signpost. About the coat in the cabin. Most of all, I think about how, after the trail curved and the figure stopped, they never had to move again to keep up with me. Because maybe they were already ahead of me. I've hiked the Appalachian Trail more times than I can count. But this trip was different. I wasn't with friends, and I wasn't following a plan. I just needed to be away from everything. My job, my apartment, my phone, people. I'd convinced myself a week alone in the mountains would clear my head. That night, somewhere near a hollow, just past Damascus, Virginia, the rain had finally let up after hammering down for most of the evening. I pitched my tent on a patch of damp earth that smelled of rot and wet leaves, wedged between two crooked poplars. The air was heavy with mist, and every breath tasted like moss. I remember sitting inside my little nylon shelter, the beam of my headlamp catching the wet sheen of tree bark through the mesh. The ground beneath me sucked and shifted when I moved. Mud never really dried out in those valleys. Crickets sang in uneven bursts, and sometimes I'd hear the distant groan of a tree bending in the fog. I tried reading, but the dampness made the pages curl and my head kept drifting. Eventually, I slid into my sleeping bag, pulled the zipper all the way up, and listened to the slow drip of water rolling off the fly sheet. That's when I must have dozed off. At some point in the night, though, I woke up, not from a noise, at least not one I can remember, but from a sensation. You know that strange awareness, like something in the room has shifted, and your body knows before your mind does. That's what it felt like. I lay there in the dark, my ears straining against the silence outside, and then I heard it. A faint, deliberate sound. Zip, zip. At first, I thought it was the wind catching the flap. But no, the sound was too steady, too intentional. Someone was dragging the zipper down. My whole body went rigid. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I stared at the faint outline of the tent's ceiling, heart thudding so hard I swore whoever was outside could hear it. The zipper stopped halfway. Nothing, just silence, thick and unbearable. I waited, seconds stretching into what felt like hours. My hand twitched toward the flashlight at my side, but I couldn't bring myself to grab it. Eventually, my body won out. I pulled the bag tighter around me, shut my eyes, and forced myself to stay still. I told myself it had to be a raccoon, maybe a stray dog sniffing around. But deep down, I knew animals don't stop like that. They don't unzip halfway and wait. I must have drifted back into some uneasy half-sleep, because when I woke again, pale morning light was leaking through the nylon walls. I sat up slowly, my body stiff and clammy, and turned to the door. The zipper was all the way down. The flap hung open just enough to let in a strip of gray light. Inside, everything was untouched. My boots were still by the entrance, my pack zipped, my food bag tied. No muddy paw prints, no sign of anything. But I knew I hadn't imagined it. Something or someone had been there, and for reasons I couldn't explain, the thought of packing up and leaving never crossed my mind. I just sat there staring at that open flap, the damp air crawling over my skin, wondering what had stopped them halfway through. I told myself to move on, to keep hiking. That's the rule out here. Don't linger on the strange stuff. But the image of that half-open zipper clung to me like the fog that refused to lift from the valleys. The next shelter was a few miles ahead, and part of me wanted the safety of 4 wooden walls, even if they were mold-stained and full of mice. By mid-afternoon, I reached it, a low, sagging structure with initials carved into every beam. The place smelled of mildew and old campfire smoke. I dropped my pack, grateful for the roof, but the unease never left. The woods around the shelter were too quiet. No birdsong, no scurrying chipmunks, just the faint hiss of the wind pushing through trees. As I set my things down, I noticed something wedged into a crack in the far wall, a small weather-worn notebook. Its cover was soft with moisture, the pages curling. I shouldn't have opened it, but of course I did. Inside were shaky entries, written in uneven pencil strokes. Some were just notes about the trail, miles covered, campsites. But a few pages in, the tone shifted. Heard footsteps outside the tent last night. Zipper moved. Didn't open it. Stayed quiet. I froze. Further down the page. 3rd night. Same thing. Always stops halfway. My stomach knotted as I flipped ahead. Don't know if I'm being followed. Nothing missing. Just the zipper. The last entry. Barely legible through smudged graphite red. If you're reading this, don't stay here. I shut the notebook. My hands damp with sweat. My brain scrambled to explain it. Maybe someone with paranoia. Maybe just a coincidence. But it was too close. Too exact. That night, I set up my tent inside the shelter, as if the extra barrier of wood would make any difference. Rain started again, hammering on the roof, and the smell of wet timber seeped in until I could taste it. I lay there wide awake, flashlight in hand, eyes fixed on the zipper of my tent door. Sometime past midnight, Between the rhythm of the rent and the creak of the beams, I heard it again. Zip, zip. My chest locked tight. The sound was faint, but it was there, sliding slow, careful, deliberate. I pressed the flashlight against my palm so hard it left a mark, but I couldn't turn it on, couldn't look. The zipper stopped halfway, and just like the night before, nothing followed. No movement, no footsteps, just silence. When morning came, the zipper was open again, everything untouched. I packed up in a haze, left the shelter, and walked until my knees buckled from exhaustion. I don't remember the miles, only the feeling of the mist pressing in, and the certainty that if I looked over my shoulder, I'd see someone standing just beyond the trees. I finished the trail weeks later, but I've never spoken about it until now. Even at home, in my apartment miles from the mountains, I can't fall asleep without checking the zipper on my jacket, my backpack, even the pillowcase. I know it doesn't make sense, but the sound follows me. That slow, careful slide, always stopping halfway and waiting. I was 2 weeks into a solo hike through the Appalachian Mountains when I stumbled across it. That morning, a cold fog hung low between the ridgelines, swallowing the trail so that each step felt uncertain, like I was walking into a dream. The air was heavy with the smell of wet leaves and wood rot, and my boots sank into mud that sucked at my heels. The guidebook I'd been using mentioned an old campsite about a mile ahead, a spot where thru-hickers sometimes stopped to refill water and rest. I expected the usual, a fire ring filled with damp ashes, maybe a few beer cans scattered around, but what I found was different. Through the mist, I saw shapes clustered between the trees. At first, I thought they were rocks, or maybe boulders covered in moss. As I got closer, I realized they were tents. 4 of them, bright nylon, dulled by weather but still standing, still zipped, still lived in, almost. I slowed down. My first thought was that hikers were camped there right now, but the clearing was silent. No voices, no fire, no movement. I stepped closer, crunching over wet pine needles. That's when I saw the gear, backpacks propped against trees, food sealed in plastic tubs, even a cook stove with a little blackened pot sitting on top. The pot was full of rainwater, as if it had been left there weeks ago. It didn't feel abandoned. It felt paused, but then I noticed the tents. Every single one of them had been cut open, not slashed from the outside, the way a bear might tear its way in, but from the inside out. The nylon was ripped in long, jagged tears, the kind a knife makes when someone cuts fast and desperate. Sleeping bags lay inside, damp and twisted. Clothes, socks, even a paperback novel lay where they had been left. Nothing had been taken. I crouched down and touched the edge of one of the cuts. The nylon was frayed and stiff, the edges curling outward. Whatever had happened here hadn't been recent, but it hadn't been decades ago either. I tried to make sense of it. Maybe the hikers panicked. Maybe they thought they heard something, an animal, a storm, and cut their way out instead of unzipping. But all of them, 4 separate tents, it didn't add up. I circled the site slowly, every step echoing in my head. My breathing sounded too loud. I thought of calling out, just in case, but something stopped me. It felt wrong to make noise here, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. At the far edge of the clearing, I found something else, a tree trunk, pale and scarred, with deep scratches carved into the bark. They weren't animal marks, they were letters. It said, "Don't stay." The words were crude, gouged with a blade. The grooves were dark with age, but not ancient. I pressed my hand against the damp wood and felt a tremor in my stomach. I backed away from the site, every instinct telling me to leave. But as I turned back toward the trail, I caught a smell, faint but unmistakable, not rot, not mold, something metallic, blood. It was enough to send me moving fast, boots slipping in mud as I hurried back onto the trail. I didn't look back at the slashed tents. I didn't want to, but even as I walked, the silence of that clearing clung to me. The untouched gear, the carved warning, the ragged slices in the fabric, none of it made sense. And the longer I thought about it, the more it felt less like I had stumbled onto something forgotten, and more like I had intruded on something unfinished. I hiked another 3 miles that day, but when night came and I set up my own tent, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw nylon splitting open, hands tearing their way out, and I heard the whisper of a knife carving letters into bark. The next morning, I told myself I'd just keep moving, put distance between me and that place. But the problem with being alone in the woods is that you have too much time to think. The image of those tents followed me, tugging at me, gnawing at the edges of every thought. By mid-afternoon, I made a decision I still regret. I turned back. The fog had burned off, and the clearing looked smaller in daylight. The colors were harsher, sunlight bouncing off nylon, shadows sharper under the trees. It felt less like a mystery, and more like a wound in the forest, open and festering. I forced myself to look inside one of the tents. The sleeping bag was half unzipped, damp with mildew. A pair of boots sat neatly by the door, as though someone had meant to put them on but never did. The oddest thing was the watch, a wristwatch, scratched but still ticking, left on top of a folded jacket. No one leaves a working watch behind. I checked another tent. Same story, personal things left in disarray. A water bottle, half full, a notebook, pages swollen from rain. I picked it up. The ink had bled, but a few lines were still legible. Scrawled handwriting, uneven and shaky. Can't sleep. Keep hearing something, not animals. Voices. The rest was smeared into nonsense. I dropped the notebook like it burned me. I wanted answers, but all I was getting were fragments, objects, scraps, warnings. And each one made me feel less like an observer, and more like I was standing in the middle of something I shouldn't know about. Then I heard it. A branch breaking, just beyond the tree line. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. It could have been a deer, or a bear. But in that instant, I didn't believe it was an animal. I believed it was someone. I didn't move for what felt like forever. My heart hammered in my ears. Finally, I forced myself to back away, one step at a time, keeping my eyes on the trees. When I reached the trail again, I didn't stop. I hiked until my legs gave out, setting up camp miles away. But I couldn't shake the thought of that sound, or the feeling that someone had been standing just out of sight, watching me. Even now, months later, I can still picture it perfectly. The slashed nylon, the carved warning, the watch still ticking on the ground. And I wonder about the hikers who camped there. Did they run barefoot into the woods, gear abandoned, because they thought something was after them? Did they cut themselves free because unzipping felt too slow? Or was it something worse, that they weren't running from anything at all, but from each other? I'll never know. What I do know is this: I don't hike alone anymore. And when the trail bends into fog, and the woods fall silent, I remember that clearing. I remember the way the air smelled like wet nylon and blood, and I keep moving, no matter how tired I am. Because I've learned one thing out there: when the mountains tell you don't stay, you go.